Thank you all for coming out this evening to participate in this teach-in. This is a very interesting topic, and it's a very complex topic. And we have an esteemed panel that I will introduce to you in a moment. And we also have Nathan Lockwood, who is the executive director of Rank the Vote, which is the organization really spearheading ranked choice voting across the United States in cities, municipalities, and in our military. So for tonight, we have really an esteemed panel that will speak to you on several of the aspects of what ranked choice voting really is all about. And I'd like to begin the introductions with Eric Maskin, who is a Nobel Prize winning economist and the Adams University professor at Harvard. There is also Natalia Linos, who is the executive director of the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights. And I'll once again say, at Harvard. The common thread for all of our panelists is that they are connected to our very large Harvard community. Bill McKibben joins us, and Bill is a little different. His focus is on the environment and climate change, and he was recently awarded the Right Livelihood Prize, and his book, The End of Nature, was the first book about climate change written for the general audience, and it has been published in 24 languages. There's Jeanne Kempthorne. I always stumble over my own name. And she was a former civil litigator and former chief of public corruption at the U.S. Attorney General's office here in the Boston area. And last but not least is Avi Green, who is the director of strategy for institutional race, power, and political economy at the New School in New York. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on introductions and sort of setting the table. I'd like to jump in right now and have Nathan Lockwood to introduce himself again, introduce the organization that he represents, and jump right into the meat of what is ranked choice voting, and also, equally important, what it is not. So Nathan, if you would take it away.
Hey, thanks very much, Rachel. I appreciate that. Jason, if you could pull up the slide deck, that would be super. All right, so we're here to talk about ranked choice voting. Next slide. So what is ranked choice voting? It's a simple improvement to our elections. And it's, Rachel mentioned, it's a nonpartisan reform that does not benefit one party more than another. All right, the states you see, red states and blue states on the screen, these are all states where ranked choice voting is being used in some form in public elections. So that's 28 states total, and that includes local elections for cities and towns in about 50 states, military and overseas voting in 7 states, and state and federal elections for all voters in Maine and Alaska. And like I said, you can see a nice even distribution there between kind of more Republican leaning and more Democratic leaning states. So all kinds of folks are using ranked choice voting right now in the US. All right, so with ranked choice voting, instead of picking just one candidate, ranked choice voting lets you rank multiple candidates in the order that you like them. So this is a sample ballot that represents the way we vote right now. There might be 4 candidates running. You get to pick one of them. Ranked choice voting is a very simple extension of our current ballots. So with ranked choice voting, you see, instead of just picking one of them, you can indicate which one is your first choice, which is your second choice, which is your third, and so on. And with this, really very fully express yourself about the candidates that are running in this election. All right, so I'm going to give folks on this call a minute just to look at this high stakes cookie ballot here and think to yourself, how would you vote on these cookies? Can you rank your favorite cookies in order using this ballot? So I'll give you 20 seconds for that. All right, now, did you find that pretty easy to do? I imagine you did. So ranked choice voting, really filling out your ballot is that easy. But the thing you might ask yourself is, okay, filling out that ballot was a piece of cake. How do you count my ballot after I cast my vote? All right, so in a couple minutes, you're going to be experts in counting ranked choice voting ballots. We're going to walk you through some simple rules, and then you're going to be a pro. So the first rule to know is to win under a ranked choice voting election, a candidate needs to get a majority of votes greater than 50%, either in the first round or in the instant runoff. And I'll point out that that is different from the elections we use now, where we pick one candidate and whoever gets the most votes wins, which sometimes, if there's a lot of candidates running, you can win one of our current elections with as little as 20 or 30% of the vote. With ranked choice voting, you need to get greater than 50%. And so we'll talk about how we do that. All right, so here we're going to look at an example here of an election with ranked choice voting. And the next rule you need to know is with ranked choice voting, when we count the ballots, we only look at voters' first choices. So who was each voter's favorite? And then we count the ballots based on their first choice. So in this example, you'll see that dark orange got 55% of the vote, followed by dark purple with 30, and so on. In this example, remember our goal is to get a winner with a majority. 55% a majority, it's greater than 50%. So we have a winner. And it was that simple, very similar to the way we vote now. But let's look at another example. In this example, the top vote getter received only 40%, also dark orange again. So there's no majority in the first round. So this is where the ranked choice voting magic kicks in. And the way it works is we're going to do an instant runoff, and we're going to do a very fine-grained instant runoff. We're just going to eliminate the candidate who received the least support, which in this case is light orange with 5%. But we're not going to, the people who voted for light orange first, we're not going to throw their ballots away. We're going to count them towards those voters' next choice. So you see here that in this example, 4 out of 5 of the light orange voters had dark orange as their next choice, and 1 out of 5 had dark purple as their next choice. And so we've counted their ballots towards their second choices and retabulated in this second runoff round. And now we've got dark orange still in the lead with 44% and dark purple behind at 36%. So guess what we're going to do? We're going to do the same thing all over again, another instant runoff round, because nobody has a majority yet. And in this case, the candidate with least support is light purple. So let's eliminate light purple. And then same thing, we take the light purple voters' ballots and we count them towards their next choice. And in this case, those votes broke really hard towards dark purple. So there was a strong affinity between the purpley voters, purpley candidate voters. And now we have dark orange with 45% and dark purple jumps into the lead with 55%. So guess what? We have our winner here, which is dark purple with a majority of 55%. And you can see the big difference this made. Without ranked choice voting, we would not see that when the choice is between dark orange and dark purple, a double-digit majority of voters preferred dark purple. And instead, with the way we vote now, we would have ended up electing a winner that was far less preferred by the electorate. So you can see the benefits of ranked choice voting right there. And that's it. It's really that simple. You're now experts in counting ranked choice voting ballots. Now, before I turn it over to Rachel and the panelists, we've got a really interesting thing to show you here, which was put together by the daughter of one of the class of 79 alumni. And so we're gonna show you that right now. This is Eva, created by Eva Phillips, daughter of HR79 Sylvia Phillips. And Eva lives in New York City, and she created this to help voters understand ranked choice voting as they were going into their June 22nd ranked choice voting primary election. All right, so here you see that simple ranked choice voting ballot we looked at earlier, and we see this simulation of a voter filling in their first, second, third, and choice, and so on. And now we've created a row with the colors of the candidates that shows that voter's preference in the order of the candidates. And now you see Eva has organized the counts for each of the colored candidates by each choice, and she's performing the eliminations just as we did, and very elegantly showing how the ballots shift to the next choice as the candidates are eliminated in the runoff rounds, until finally we're down to the last three here. We have a winner who's achieved a majority of support. So a really beautiful visualization of the process there, showing the ballots and how they get stacked up to create a count. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Rachel. Thank you so much.
Let's jump in and start asking questions. Eric, the question that I have for you is, first off, what really attracted you to the whole notion of ranked choice voting? And one of our registrants suggested that it's just too difficult. You need to be overly educated to understand how to make it work. And if that's the case, are there any real benefits to voters?
So what attracted me to ranked choice voting in the first place? I should explain that I actually study voting systems for a living. It's part of my job. And one thing that appealed strongly to me about ranked choice voting is that, as Nathan was suggesting, it reflects what voters really want better than the current system. So, and to see that, let's think of the 2016 presidential primaries in the Republican Party. You'll recall that there were a whole bunch of candidates, including Donald Trump and Marco Rubio and John Kasich. Now, polls showed early on that in a one-to-one contest, both Rubio and Kasich would have defeated Trump if it were a two-person race. But because they ran together under our current system, they split the vote. And that meant that Trump emerged as the victor in many of the early primaries, in fact, the first 17. If the Republican Party had been using ranked choice voting for their primaries, then people who preferred Kasich and Rubio to Trump could have ranked them Rubio, Kasich, Trump, or Kasich, Trump, Kasich, Rubio, Trump, and both Kasich and Rubio would have emerged ahead of Trump, which actually seems to better reflect what Republican voters really wanted in the early stage of the primary. So that's a major reason why I favor ranked choice voting. It really reflects what voters want. Now, is it more complicated than ordinary voting? Well, there's a sense in which it is, because ranking is conceptually a little bit more complicated than simply picking one candidate, as we largely do now. But I should point out that as Nathan was suggesting, ranking your favorite cookies is not so hard. Similarly, ranking your favorite candidates is not so hard. And in fact, the country of Australia has been using ranked choice voting now for over 100 years to elect members of the lower house of parliament. And it's worked just fine there. People understand it. They find it a successful voting system. My view is that if the Australians can do it, we can do it too.
Well, you know, that's very interesting because ranked choice voting implies that we're having a more representational form of government. And one of our audience members has asked a question. And the question is whether people are actually satisfied with the results if their candidate ends up being the second or third or fourth choice. And they're looking at the most recent New York City election, and they're saying there's the potential for lack of enthusiasm for the elected politician and whatever policies he or she may bring, because they weren't their first choice. How would you respond to that?
All of politics is something of a compromise. I give up a little bit of what I want so that you can have a little bit of what you want. We're never going to have unanimity on any issue, but the advantage of ranked choice voting over the current system is that in the end, the majority is having their say. They may not be having their say about their first choice. That it may be too much to ask for, that a majority of people agree on their first choice. That's an impossibility. But the candidate who, in the end, is selected by ranked choice voting will be endorsed by a majority of voters over the remaining candidates. And that already suggests that voters can take some satisfaction in who gets elected, as opposed to the current system where, as Nathan was suggesting, a candidate may be elected with less than 30% of the vote. It's true that those people get their first place choices, but 70% may be getting someone that they can't stand at all. That's the problem with the current system. It creates polarization, whereas ranked choice voting brings us together and reduces polarization.
Thank you for your comments. Natalia, have you been able to get back on the Zoom?
I'm back on a cell phone. I apologize. My Wi-Fi is having trouble, so I'm on my cell phone.
Not a problem. It's all, the most important thing is that you're here tonight. So we've heard that there's a balance and a real benefit to voters. Is there a benefit to the candidates themselves?
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, and I'm really happy to take that question and answer it from having been a candidate. So in 2020, I decided to run for Congress. It was an open seat. There were 9 of us, as Nathan said, one of these races where there are many candidates. That's not unique to our race. That happens often when there are open seats. And I was considered a non-traditional candidate. So, non-traditional in many ways. I am an epidemiologist. I work at Harvard. I had spent my career at the UN. I am an immigrant in many ways. I mean, I was born in the US, so I have citizenship, but my parents still live in Greece, so we don't have family wealth. Most candidates have a lot of wealth, a lot of networks, relatively young, a mom, things that people are saying. We want more diverse candidates, right? And yet what happens in elections, and what I found out pretty quickly, is that the minute you enter, people start using a proxy for electability. And that has nothing to do with your positions or how much the public likes you, they're using other proxies. And the main proxy is fundraising, so how much money you have, and possibly something around media coverage, but weirdly, the two are linked together. So how much money you have and media is what people pay attention to. And early on, I was seen as non-electable because, you know, I only had 4 months. I entered the race very late. So they were like, there's no way she's going to there were people who already had $3 million and I was entering. So they said, you know, she doesn't have money. And yet my message was appealing to a lot of people. So I was talking to quite educated voters who were saying, yes, I love your message and you're clearly the right person for the moment. You know, we're in the middle of COVID, you have an epidemiology background, you're likable, you know, but you're not electable, so I don't want to waste my vote. And it goes back to the previous comment about splitting the vote. There was this sense that I would be a waste of a vote. And so everybody who I spoke to said, yes, you are my top candidate, but I can't in full kind of confidence vote for you. If I knew that everybody was doing the same, I would vote for you. Or if I don't want to waste my vote. So it felt that the public was feeling that they would be wasting a vote and they wanted me to be there. So now from a candidate perspective, it's difficult to feel like you may have been responsible for splitting the vote. So in our case, a man, Representative Jake Auchincloss won with under 30%. And then number 2, 3, 4, 5 were all women. So I do think that the district really wanted a woman to be the candidate. You know, they were. And yet, you know, people were saying the women are going to split the vote. It's an unfortunate mantra. But also, then what does that say to candidates? Like, don't run? Like, there was this push. People asked me and many others to drop out. But, you know, if this is democracy and people should be running, if we want to have less traditional candidates, if we want to have more diverse candidates, then the only people who can stay in a race are those who are deemed electable. So I think ranked choice voting basically takes that element out. So it allows people like me to step in and can answer with full, you know, faith that no, you're not wasting your vote. If you really believe in my message, you know, vote for me, and you know, you're not going to waste your vote. And I do think that that's important for both first-time candidates, non-traditional candidates, but also keeping people to run again. You know, I felt very discouraged at the end of the race. You know, by the way, the fact that I had raised very little money in the end was impactful, but I did have the most votes per dollar. Like, I think if people had believed that, you know, like that proxy was just, it's not true. You know, there were people who were spending $100 per vote in this race, and I was spending less than 10 per vote, you know, at the end when we saw it. So that proxy of money is just a wrong proxy. And I think ranked choice voting, while I haven't looked at the numbers, I do think it would favor people who aren't able to fundraise early on and therefore, you know, build that momentum. So I think that candidates could benefit from it. I think obviously most importantly, the voters benefit from having candidates that look and are representative of them in more ways.
Thank you. Thank you. Very thoughtful. So if there's all of this potential benefit to candidates, why has it become such a partisan issue? You know, like so many things here in the US at this moment, it's split right down the middle, you know, Democrats, Republicans.
I don't know that it is a partisan issue. You know, we've seen Maine, which has a lot of independents embrace it. We saw New York City, obviously more Democratic, but also Utah. You know, I don't actually think, I think if we bucket it with other kind of voting, you know, reforms and ensuring, you know, people actually have access to vote, yes, maybe that's more of a belief. But you know, maybe this is a better question to Nathan, but I think that there has been support from all sides. And actually, what ranked choice voting does is that it allows people to not have to cater to a very small percentage. So without ranked choice voting, if you're in a 9-way race, you know you can win with 20%. So actually, if you know that 20% are pretty far right or pretty far left, you can tailor your message in a way that is only appealing to that 20%. I think ranked choice voting forces candidates to appeal to actually 50%. They have to get 50% at the very end. So you have to have a message that is actually representative. And so I actually don't think it is a, you know, Democratic or Republican. It actually forces candidates to be a little bit more fluid and a little bit more able to, and forces people to listen to all sides, and therefore maybe makes them more able to be the representative that they're supposed to be. You know, once you're elected, you are supposed to represent every single person in your district, not just the people who voted for you. So in that sense, having had to have those conversations with people who you may ideologically disagree with forces you to then know what they care about when you are actually representing them. So I don't actually think it's as partisan as people maybe think it is.
Okay, well, we're going to find out sooner or later whether it is or it isn't. So, Avi, I was told that I could ask you anything that I wanted, and I'm going to take them up on that. So early on, Eric talked about Australia. And why do you think Australia is a successful model for ranked choice voting?
Well, I think Australia is one successful model for ranked choice voting, but I do want to, before zooming in on Australia, make the point that Nathan did earlier, which is that there's plenty of examples within the United States and increasingly around the world of other places using ranked choice voting as well, such as for the election of president in Ireland and president in India, municipal races in Britain and New Zealand, as well as all of those 50 cities across the United States. I actually think that the reason that ranked choice voting was implemented in Australia is similar to the reason why people are going for it today in the United States, and it has to do with the critical ingredients for when election reforms, election changes happen. Most of the time, election changes don't happen. I mean, it's very rare that people change their election laws. It tends to happen when a majority of people are concerned the system they like is falling apart, the system that gives them currently, make sure that some of their voices are heard. The governing coalition is concerned that it won't be able to govern anymore, and it wants to take actions to improve or strengthen, as they see it, the system. So in Australia, the same thing was happening there as happened in the United States about 100 years ago, which was huge huge growth in cities. Lots and lots of people were living less. They were not living in rural areas anymore, and they were living more in cities as cities were growing. And that really shook up the party system in Australia and created a moment when, and they had three parties there, when in some cases the Conservative Party was worried about getting wiped out. In other cases, the Labour Party was worried about getting wiped out. And in some cases, the Liberal Party in the middle, they were worried about getting wiped out. And they recognized that they were having a lot of perverse results. That is, sometimes someone would win a local election, in a liberal, more progressive, whatever you want to call it, district in Sydney. You would see the Conservative winning with 40% of the vote, when the two liberal parties, the Liberal and the Liberal and Labour, would put together 60% of the vote. And similarly, you'd see, the opposite thing happening sometimes in rural communities. And they were basically able to hash out an agreement that they would prefer to see a majority winner in every case. And so they went with ranked choice voting nationally for the House of Representatives, and they've used it ever since. It is not, one of the nice things about ranked choice voting is it's an incremental change that has great power, but it's not it's not like taking the existing election system and turning it upside down. And what's useful about that is the people in the United States are not going to be willing to take the existing election system and turn it upside down. People are often scared, and rightly so, of radical change that they don't know what to expect. But in this case, in most elections, the outcome will remain the same. But really bad outcomes that we sometimes see when you have an election where there's many candidates, and one candidate's able to pull off a victory with 20% of the vote or 30% of the vote, even if 60 or 70% seem to have different feelings. That's a really defective moment for our democracy. And it seems like Republicans and Democrats can agree, and independents as well, that that's not a good system. And for me, as somebody who's worked in campaigns, I want to point out that it also changes the role of party operatives. Party operatives spend a lot of time convincing people to run, and unfortunately, also trying to tell people not to run. And I'm sure Natalia experienced this frequently as people came to her and said, I love you, I care about you, you're great. Please don't offer your ideas to the people of your district. That would be a terrible thing and a disservice to your values. The nice thing about RCV is that it does not, it takes that incentive away. And that is a really wonderful side effect.
Interesting. So, Bill, I'd like to ask you a question that's come from our audience. They're describing an election where a candidate needs more than 50% of the vote, or a runoff is going to be triggered. And is that runoff functionally the equivalent of ranked choice voting?
So, Rachel, first of all, many thanks for letting me join in this discussion, even though I'm not from the Harvard class of '79. In fact, let me say, I came from the Harvard class of 1982, which meant when I arrived at Harvard, the class of '79 were the giants that bestrode the campus. And I went to work immediately at the Crimson. And so there may be people there on this call who remember people like Frank Conley or Laurie Hayes or George Sweetenham or Mark Whitaker or other just giants who taught me an enormous amount. I raise this because my experience with ranked choice voting mostly comes from my years at the Crimson. I covered the city of Cambridge politics, and spent 4 years down in Central Square at City Hall. And the reason that's important is because, forget Australia, the place in America that's had ranked choice voting for 100 years is the city of Cambridge. It was called proportional representation, but it was and is a remarkable system. And I got to know it well because I covered 2 elections for city council. Let me say also that in answer to this question about runoffs and instant runoffs and the things that technology allows us now, in those days in Cambridge, it was all conducted on paper ballots. And so it took a full week of counting with 100 people in the high school gymnasium moving paper ballots around as candidates were eliminated. So why was that worth doing? Well, there's 2 reasons really that you come to understand if you're a political reporter who's covering the whole campaign and thinking about it. Really 3, and people have gotten at 2 of them already. One is that it is fairer and produces a result more in line with what more people want. And as Natalia points out, it also reduces the chances that people are going to be perceived as spoilers, and so allows a wider diversity of viewpoints. But the 3rd reason, and one that I think people don't comment on as often or think about as often, is in some ways just as interesting to me. Think about being a candidate in a race like this. So you're trying to get people to make you their number 1 choice. But if they're not going to make you their number 1 choice, you're trying to make you their number 2 or their number 3 choice, which means that you can't go around savaging all the other candidates all the time. You have to actually think about ways to appeal to the people that would rank them number 1. And so there's a penalty for polarizing the electorate. And given what we've stumbled into in this country over the last 30 or 40 years, that's an important thing to think about. In the last couple of years, we've worked hard to form this new outfit, Third Act, that organizes people over the age of 60, which I think may include the class of '79 at this point. on issues around democracy and also around climate change. And they're very closely linked. So we think a lot about democracy, and our democracy is, I mean, it's not that there's like a small problem with our democracy that we need some small technical fixes to. We had a attempt at a violent coup to overthrow our country, 15 months ago. We desperately need some things that shake up how we do things and shake up the insane levels of polarization that we've fallen into. And so ranked choice voting is really interesting in this regard too. It really does represent almost the only simple thing you could do that has some chance of really breaking up some of the clots that have formed in our body politic.
Very interesting point. I'd like for you and Jeanne to share the next question. Again, a question that's coming from our audience is that everything that you've said tonight, all of the panelists, is very persuasive. But the question is there any real evidence that RCV brings about better policies from better elected leaders? Or is it too early? Do we know?
Well, I can't say that I can speak to the data. I am, kind of a democracy warrior, but I can't say that I'm a scholar. So I think a lot of the effects, though, we can anticipate because of just the mechanics of how it works. I can't see how ranked choice voting would not have improved the outcomes in a whole bunch of elections we can think about, that we know about, the 4th congressional in Massachusetts that we've just heard about, the presidential election and so forth. So I think there, theoretically, again, not on a data level, but theoretically, if candidates have to compete across a broader swath of the electorate, they have to work harder to make their message comprehensible and attractive, right? I can't see how that isn't going to have an impact on the content of the policy in a moderating way and in a clarifying way. So I yield. Bill, I'm sure you'll have data at your fingertips.
Actually, Eric has his hand up, and I have a feeling that this is going to become interesting.
He's going to make everything I said irrelevant.
No, what you said was definitely relevant, but furthermore, we do have data to back this up. And again, I turn to Australia. A student of mine looked at elections over many years in Australia and compared the outcomes, the electoral outcomes under ranked choice voting as practiced in the lower house with what would have happened had they used the American system of plurality rule. And the data are quite clear that ranked choice voting leads to more centrist candidates winning. And also, interestingly, more women and minorities winning. Now this of course is not a study in our own country, but if we don't believe that Australians are fundamentally different from Americans, then I think this study tells us something important.
Great. So Jeanne, going back to you, and this is because you've looked at corruption issues and you're more focused in that area. Do you think that ranked choice voting would actually help in the area of accountability and making our elected politicians more accountable to the people that they represent. And also, when politicians throw out the notion that I'll accept term limits, wouldn't ranked choice voting be better than just someone saying, let's have term limits, and that means that once you're in, you're also almost on your way out?
I mean, both of those issues raise the problem of incumbency getting rather sticky, right? Where you can't get people out once they're in. I've thought about this question, and I think the main impact, and again, you know, Eric and others may jump in and say, you're all wet on this, but I think that the impact on accountability is going to be through increased competition by making candidates in effect answerable to voters beyond a narrow base. Incumbents will be forced to address their record and will be subject to greater scrutiny, possibly in a way they haven't had to in the past. I think, you know, RCV should make a broader range of candidates viable, which will necessarily mean that incumbents will have to answer to a broader range of questions about their conduct in and out of office. So, I mean, I don't know how many of the audience are from Massachusetts, but I really want to tell a story about how the current plurality system, and that's what we call the system where it's just the person who gets the largest number of votes wins, even if it doesn't meet the 50% threshold. It can make it pretty easy for candidates with glaring deficits, I'm talking, you know, criminal conduct, to squeak by on the strength of a small base of supporters, even when an overwhelming majority of voters disapprove of the candidate. So, you know, if you are familiar with this story, bear with me, but it does bear repeating, and it's certainly wonderful for people who've never heard it. So I'm going to tell this little story about the mayoral race in Fall River in 2019 here in Massachusetts. Very young candidate, a man named Jaciel Correa, had been charged. So he's the sitting mayor. He'd been charged in a federal indictment with wire fraud and tax fraud, and he'd been arrested. So the city council asked him to resign. He refused. So they put it to a recall vote. And in a single ballot, the voters were asked first, should he be recalled? And if that resulted in a yes vote, then they were to move, you know, then the second part of the ballot would be considered. And 5 people put their names in, including the embattled mayor, which was allowed under the rules. Well, you can imagine what happened. In the very single ballot, 61% of the voters want him out of office. 61% want him out of office. So, okay, now we move to the second part of the ballot. And you're never going to believe this. He's reelected with a scant 35% of the vote. And he is reelected mayor. So what could be a clearer evidence that plurality voting can allow a candidate to evade accountability? I mean, it's just clearly nuts. Any system that allows this to happen, we have to conclude is seriously flawed, and RCV would have prevented it, because the runner-up vote was, the runner-up lost by only 300 votes. So this gentleman was ultimately convicted by a federal jury, convicted of not only fraud and tax crimes he was originally charged with, but flagrant abuse of his office, including extortion and bribery. He ran again while the case was pending. Unbelievable. And so this is in 2019. He comes in second in a 3-person preliminary election. So the third person is cast out, and now it's a head-to-head between him and the runner-up, the original runner-up. He tells his supporters that he can't win in a head-to-head fight against the front runner, but let's mount a write-in campaign, which will split the vote like what happened in the recall election. So clearly, this very young mayor learned a valuable lesson from his experience. But what he learned is that plurality voting is a system that can be gained. So, you know, I think that says a great deal, in addition to the anecdotes we can all come up with about how RCV might make accountability more accessible to the electorate. You know, bottom line, I think RCV will engage more voters to vote, and those voters will have an incentive to learn more about each candidate rather than voting party lines. And I think it has to help accountability.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an important topic that we have to consider every time we go to the voting polls. So one of our audience members talked about the experience of Cincinnati and how, I guess, the party machinery actually came out and prevented ranked choice voting from being implemented. What can anyone do in order to, if they're so inclined, to move this forward as a body politic? And that's enough of a question. That's loaded right there. Is it messaging? Is it talking to the Secretary of State and trying to get it enacted? Is it talking to the politicians who are already very steeped in the system? Let's take that one apart.
Can I jump in for that?
Yeah, go ahead. And then Eric, will go to you after that.
Yeah, I apologize, Eric. I'm not as good at the hand raising function within Zoom. So I guess I'm going to suggest, I spent the better part of a decade working on election reforms in Massachusetts, and then have also worked on some of them elsewhere. And I would suggest that it often takes a village or an association or an organization, so that if you are interested in becoming involved, learning more, advancing ranked choice voting, the best move is to join an organization. And the reason is that what is the right thing to do is going to depend on the context where you live, what's going on there, what set of political connections and knowledge you already have, what are the resources that you've got. I mean, if, for example, if somebody on this call is a professional election administrator, then your role is going to be different than somebody who has a podcast, or somebody who works at a foundation, or someone who works in government. So I think it really depends. The other thing that I would say is that the other value of organization is that election reform is a long game. So we would say, you know, in Australia, they've had it for 100 years, but they didn't just turn the switch in 1918. They didn't just have a 1-month conversation about this and then decide to implement at the national level. It actually took a number of years, and there was a number of years afterwards of implementation and conversation. The ranked choice voting movement in the United States has been going for some time and has accelerated a lot recently, but has years to go. And the only way to enjoy and to make a difference over years, I think, is by being part of organizations and communities and associations.
Thank you, very thoughtful. Eric.
So one reason why party machines have sometimes tried to stand in the way of ranked choice voting is because entrenched politicians have something to fear if ranked choice voting gets passed. As Natalia was saying, ranked choice voting gives more of an edge to an outsider. People will not be so afraid to vote for an independent, an outsider, because they're not throwing away their vote with ranked choice voting the way they would be under the current system. So party machines do have something to fear when ranked choice voting is on the table, and that's why states which can pass voting reform through voter referenda have an advantage. The state of Maine passed ranked choice voting for congressional and state elections, not because the legislature did it. They tried to repeal it, in fact, but because the people of Maine voted for it in a ballot initiative. Same thing happened in Alaska. Alaska also uses ranked choice voting now for federal elections, and that was passed by the people of Alaska. So for those of you who live in states where ballot initiatives are possible, ranked choice voting should be on the agenda for a ballot initiative.
Thank you. Thank you. One last question. There was a question about the fact that the military is using ranked choice voting in overseas balloting for our armed forces. If it can be adopted by the military, why is it so difficult to adopt it stateside? Eric, do you want to take a crack at that?
It's my understanding that ranked choice voting has been used for the military as a time-saving device. So there are some states where they have a runoff system. If no one gets a majority in the first round, then the top two candidates go to a runoff. That's going to work against people in the military because their ballots aren't even going to come in until sometime after the election. And so to save time, military personnel are asked to rank the candidates in the first place. I think that explains at least some of the difference between the military and the domestic policy.
Okay, thank you very much. That question had been almost at the beginning of our discussion this evening, and I would have been remiss if I hadn't found time to just fold it in and to provide a response. So we're really coming up to the end of the hour. Again, I'd like to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank Nathan Lockwood from Rank the Vote and all of our audience members this evening.